welcome to episode 19 of Guitar Hangs. Nick Granville in Wellington, myself in Auckland. It's been a while since we did the last one, so Nick, fill us in as usual.
Yeah, we played the Capital Blues Club on Friday, which was okay.
Nice.
I'd like to say it was really good, but it was a little bit loose.
As
Band
they
was
tend to
good,
be,
but
yeah.
we had a kapahaka group there that were all friends of Brannigans, and all like singers can sing, but thought it was their place to sort of jump up and sing whenever they want. So there was a lot of that, and it was sort of like I was trying to manage it and keep it. So, but it was good otherwise. There were some good moments, but some of it just got a bit out of control. But everybody played really well, and that band's so fun to play with. I mean, the band was just stonking. The groove was really happening. So yeah, but that was good.
I've experienced that before, like, unsolicited additions to the set. People just walk.
Usually it's sax players, I hate to say, because sax players, just think they can, or harmonica players, they just take their instrument out and start playing and sort of help
I don't know if
themselves
I've
to
told
a
you
mic.
the story because people used to ask my first band, why do you guys tune down a half step? And we used to like, oh, so it sounds heavier and everything. But the actual reason was that when we just started playing, there was this guy who used to show up with harmonica and wanted to sit in. So we figured if we tune down a half step, he won't have the harmonica and the
You won't have
correct
an E flat or a D flat up.
And we were just starting.
We used to
so
do
we're
that
like,
with this.
Yeah, we can't play those other keys. Sorry. So
We used to do that with this singer. It was a bit mean. There was this John McLaughlin thing that the dancer Maya from the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and in the middle of that song they go into a blues form, but it's a blues in like 10/4 rather than in 4/4.
okay.
And whenever singers would sit in that we wanted to get rid of, we'd play this groove, and it goes. But the time of it is not dun, 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 it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's actually quarter note triplets against it. 3, 4. You'd hear it as that, right? But the time's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,
Right.
8, 9, 10. And so you'd have the drummer playing quarter note, and this, and singers would be going, I don't know what to do, and then they'd soon sort of scurry off, and if it was someone who was like being a pain in the ass, it was a good way to get rid of them.
Yeah. You know the joke about
all good if
how,
someone's a good singer and they're wanting to contribute, but if it's someone who's just making a nuisance of themselves, then that was a good way to do it.
Yeah.
Sorry, what were you can say?
I was gonna say, the joke about how do you know when there's a singer knocking at your door?
Oh yeah, they don't know when to come and what the key is.
Can't find the key.
Where
and
the
don't
key
know when
is.
to come.
Yeah.
There's great singers who make your life amazing, and there are singers who can challenge
Ruin the
one's
night.
ability to stay calm.
Yeah. What about you, man? What's been happening?
I've been again stuck at the home studio. Actually, I've got a couple of rehearsals coming up because I think I told you I've got a gig in Wellington at the end of the month. It's this
Yeah, you did.
local Bollywood artist in Auckland, and he found out the stuff that I'd played on him, so he asked me to play on a gig with him, and that went off pretty well. We did a gig I think sometime last year, so now he's got one in Wellington at the end of the month, and then another one in Auckland sometime in September, I think. So yeah, I've just been woodshedding a couple of those. Most of the set I have played before, so that's convenient. But just
Man, while you're here, we should record one of these in person.
we should definitely try and do that. I'm just gonna figure because
If we can.
we come in on a Friday night, so that could be one option. Depending if
Yeah,
there's a
definitely.
sound check or a rehearsal or
fun.
something that gets in the way, then we'll work around it.
Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
cool.
So while I was doing all that, I had some time playing around with the home studio and amps and stuff like that. So I thought about what we could talk about today is post processing. The stuff that engineers do to
Sure.
your guitar sound after you've recorded and packed up and gone home. What happens then? So
Yeah, it's a good question actually, because I had a session last week for someone, and they he said, it was like a sort of a dance beat track with like weird trumpety sort of stuff over, almost Saint Germain type vibe, you know what I mean? So I played some bits. I played some things like some those sort of things, and some those sort of very funky rhythmic things, and then I put in some like big sort of stabby chord type things that he could sort of insert. And but what I did was I did about 7 takes, I think it was, 3 rhythm and 3 lead parts, and because there was no kind of form to it, he's going to cut and paste it and put it all together. So there's every chance I won't recognize a single thing that I played. Because he's going to cut and paste it all together and move it around and take, like the stabby, distorted chords. He may not use that at all, or maybe I might have played it here, but he'll move it over here and that sort of stuff. So that'll be interesting. And also, too, he tends to mess with guitar parts a little bit, this guy, Some pretty drastic EQ stuff and things like that. I used my Fractal and just recorded direct into his laptop. So that's how we got the guitar tones for that one, because it was 1 track and it just made sense to do it that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, even then, I mean, it's sort of the post processing could be very interesting. He'll probably put some delays on my stuff, even though I recorded it with delays. Like, oh, hang on, the delays are off at the moment. Where are they?
Yeah.
I think that's the sort of level of repeats, like a mono delay. That's so it'll be interesting to see kind of where he goes with it. I've always been of the train of thought that once you're finished playing, it's out of your hands now. You can't do anything about it, and not even worth worrying about.
Yeah.
All
you can do is complain when it comes out.
Yeah. Oh, I've had it heaps of times, man. I did a session for someone, and he said, you may want to come and have a listen to this guitar sound. And I was like, oh, here we go. I was playing my old Gibson Archtop that's up there. It's like a 1948 Gibson L4, right? So beautifully warm guitar, real woody tone. It was largely kind of an acoustic vibe, and he made it sound like a 1987 Stratocaster. It was awful. It was so bad, and it was distorted. And I'm like, he goes, did you have some kind of Schofield-esque distortion? I was like, no, man, I was dead clean. The engineer had cranked the gain on the desk and was clipping the channel constantly, so it sounded like I almost had like that nasty, like the Beatles Revolution sort of guitar sound. That's direct, Yeah, and I was just like, oh man. But the bass sound was actually even worse, so I didn't feel too bad. Like the bass sounded and I was like, but yeah, sometimes you can't help it what people do, so and in that case, the first thing I said to him was, whatever EQ you've done, take it off. Get rid of it. And sure enough, he'd done a low cut, but he'd done it from about 300 rather than, quite high, cutting into the low mids. No wonder the guitar sound. Yeah, and he was like, oh, I'm trying to make some more clarity for the bass around that frequency. I'm like, no, you're just making the guitar sound like shit. Get rid of that, right? So I got rid of that, and then I was like, right, the way you've done this, it's distorted. There's not much we can do about that,
Yeah.
But I sort of did a little bit of EQ work and got it a little better. And then I said to him, like, you guys can't put this out. And sure enough, they did. Whatever.
Yeah, so I think that's a good segue into one of the first things they'll do is EQ, just to get it to fit into the track. Now, I am of the, shall we say, firm opinion that you should probably be doing that sort of thing at the time of tracking. You basically you get your EQ to fit in your guitar part to what's going on around you. So, assuming sometimes they want to have, that ability to control it later. So what they could do is just monitor through some EQ at the time. And then they are free to, go back and finally dial that. Maybe just do broad strokes at the time of tracking and then, dial it in later. So here's something to, it'd be good if I had it on. Now, there's a nice full low end going on here. So let's look at chopping out some of the low end frequencies. We'll go bit by bit, because what I've got here is this Neve 1084 EQ, and it's got low cut filters and high cut filters. So we'll do the low cut, starting around 45 hertz. So as it is, there's very little information, I think, below, say, around 55, 60 hertz, maybe some subharmonic resonance from the speaker cabinet that comes through. but normally around 70 is a good place to cut. So that's 70. So let's compare between 0 and 70. So 70 makes it a little tighter, and another advantage is it also doesn't need as much headroom. So you're kind of using less of the metering. You can actually see the meters actually go down a little bit the moment you start cutting lows. Now around 160 is if it was a
That's
second.
That's an important point you just brought up there. And I don't think people are aware about this a lot of the time. If you have too many of certain frequencies,
Yep.
it will push the meters up. I had this recording the other day that I did, and the bass in the whole mix was making everything spike. I got them to turn the bass down, and all of a sudden we were no longer spiking, and the whole track could go like that overall, and
You
push the levels up.
instantly get a few dBs of headroom, because there's a thing like if you look at your meter, there's like when I track guitar, I'll probably want to peak around -12, -10 or so, at the most, just so I have that headroom for processing. If I need to push it up in the track, there's a ton of things I can do to bring up the gain apart from just, turning up the fader. So, you kind of want to use your available headroom judiciously. If you're going to pile it with a bunch of low end, which is not going to be heard in the track in context, then you're kind of just wasting that headroom you have available on the guitar track. So the first thing most engineers will do is, apart from the kick and the bass, is start low cutting things, usually judiciously. Anything, up to around 100 or so. That seems to be like a good median point, and just move it back and forth. So I listen to it in the mix, and you start cutting out the low end while it's in the mix. The moment you start hearing it thin out, just back it off a bit.
Do you check out that guy Colt Caparoon? Is that
I've
his
seen some
name?
of his videos here.
Did you see the one he talked about? There was a recent video where he was talking about low cut and about how it affects phase of instruments. And that was something I hadn't really considered before. When you put a low cut in, that it will affect the phase of. So he showed with the example with a bass drum and put it in the recording, and then he put the low cut in and he duplicated the same recording, and he showed that the two were actually cancelling each other out, which means that it had shifted the phase.
The phase, yeah.
But by doing the low cut.
Yep.
So he said it's something you've got to be really careful of if you have multiple microphones, like on a bass drum. And especially on guitar too. I mean, with fractal stuff, you don't have to worry about that because all the microphones are already phase aligned and all that sort of stuff. And you can actually deliberately push it out, but they kind of do all that for you. But it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Like that actually shifts the phase of where it's sitting,
Which is why you have something called a linear phase EQ, which lets you keep the phase intact. So if that is something that is going to crop up, I'm just talking about a single guitar track, not a multiple. And usually what I would
But it might have two microphones, right?
In that case, I'd group them to one fader and put the EQ on that.
Right.
So I just EQ them together.
Because a lot of times engineers don't do that. I see them keeping them as two separate tracks.
Yep.
And they just put low cut on one and a low cut on another, and I'm like, you can just see it's going to be a problem, isn't it?
The only reason I like keeping them separate is just so I can control the blend. Otherwise, I just process them as one, to be honest, if it's just a single guitar part. And earlier on, I used to, if there were two mics, I'd pan one left, pan one right, and maybe even delay one a little bit just so you get like that, pseudo stereo thing happening. But of late, I kind of just like the coherence of just having it, at a single location and letting the reverb or maybe the room mics do the imaging.
I'm finding that too, that the hard panning of two parts doesn't necessarily work as well as the more, like 45 instead of a full 90-degree pan, can be.
Yeah, if I was going to hard pan it, I'd probably end up double tracking the part. And then just putting each, them left and right.
That's what I do too, for sure, because then they're not the exact same part. Because when they're exact same part with two microphones, that's when phase becomes an issue.
Yeah.
But it's not if they're different performance. There's enough overlapping anyway. So you low cut around 70. I'm the same. I do 80 as my default for everything in the fractal. And then 8K on the top end is usually where I high-end sort of cut. And I always tell the engineers that I work with, all of them, I always say, I've already done the high cut and the low cut. Leave it alone. Yeah. No compression. And leave it alone.
What I'm talking about is the primary guitar. Now, if there's multiple guitars going on, then I'm like a Nazi with that low cut. I'll go all the way to like sometimes 400-500 if need be. If that's just a little thing that's just tickling the upper mid frequencies, I don't need all that low end. The main guitar is already handling that. So,
Yep.
like for example, we were on 70, right? So let's just recalibrate our ears. That's 70. That's 160. These are preset frequencies on the Neve EQ, which is why I'm just going between these. So now that takes out some of the low frequencies. For sure, you can hear a noticeable, drop in the low end. But if the part was somewhere here, something like that, I wouldn't need all that low end. Or even if it was on the neck pickup, if it was like, I don't need that full, low end, which is, you can hear how all that comes back. But in the context of the part, if I'm going back to like 160, it just cleans up that low end considerably. Now, if I go like the 360, it could work really well, especially
totally.
if I had a bunch of delay or something to make it floaty. Now I'll put the
The
low
other thing
end
too
back
is that you're also on
on
the
the
neck
neck,
pickup,
exactly.
which needs clarity,
So
doesn't it?
can you hear all those notes hitting against each other, and you can hear the that slight dissonance? Now that's predominantly from the low frequencies. You can just clean it up. Something like that, So that's a really useful thing. Now I'm going to go back onto 70.
It's an interesting thing you say that, because I remember on the Sports Awards gig that, month ago or whenever it was, the engineer said to me, I'm finding the guitar a little mid-range heavy. He goes, do you mind if I EQ it for everybody's in-ears? And I was like, leave it alone. Like, it's a mid-range instrument. It's meant to be, do you know what I mean? And I like a sparklier, clean sound, but I like a fatter, thicker mid-range for the lead tones, you know what I mean? And knew what would happen is he'd EQ it, and then all of a sudden it would sound nasty in our ears, because it sounded amazing as it was. So, but you're right. It's like that whole notion that if we have too much bottom end down there, it affects the harmonics, it affects how things resonate together. But it also, guitar's a mid-range instrument, and that's where it lives. That's where the magic is. So.
True. So what I was looking at right now were like low cut filters. So like they're pretty, and there's one parameter called the slope of the filter. So a 6 dB per octave filter would be the most, gentle. And then you can go all the way to 24, I think 32, which is like a really sharp, drop, which doesn't sound as natural to me, but they can be useful, especially if you've got some crud to clean up. They can be pretty, like surgical. So the next thing I want to look at on this EQ is now like a low slope EQ. Now this is a more broad strokes thing. So like say we'll put it at 110, which is the starting point here.
Before you move on though, if A is 440, right?
Yep.
Right, 440. Do you know what E is?
I think it's 82 and multiples of that. And so the A440 is actually this one. This is
right, yeah.
That is probably 110 or 220. That actual fundamental frequency.
Right, because it's a division of it, isn't it?
Yeah, they're all multiples, yeah. So I think 82
multiples.
is the lowest note on the guitar in standard tuning.
Right.
I know that for a fact.
Like in terms of your frequencies are...
Your fundamental frequency, the lowest one would be 82. If you're tuned down, that'll go further. And I think I started at 70 because I used to be tuned to E flat. So, that could explain some of that.
So that's actually a good point too, because if you drop tune, everything changes, doesn't it?
It does considerably. All your harmonics are, changing in scale. So this is now 110 hertz, either a cut or a boost. So a cut is going to be like that, So we don't really have a EQ, a dB readout, but I'm guessing it's around 6 to 8 dB of a cut. Now this sounds really nice if you want to make it. It's almost like the bass knob on your amp, and if you turn it up, you'll get the. Now let's do that at 220 instead. You'll hear the thing sound a little more extreme than, see? You still hear the low end there, but it's almost like that whole chunk of frequencies has just been brought down in comparison to the mids and the highs.
But that can be the perfect thing for some tracks
Exactly.
sometimes, can't it?
Yep. So there's a
Yeah.
difference between that broad strokes, shelving EQ and the filter. The filters are a little more surgical than those. The next thing is a cut around 300 to 400 that cleans up the whole low mid spectrum considerably. So now if it was like a more, like say a heavy distorted guitar part, for example, cutting that will just clean up that whole, and I'll take that off, put it back on to around, there we go, that more scooped kind of chugga chugga distortion, something like that. So that is a useful frequency if you're trying to clean up, your low mid stuff, especially with heavier guitar layers. I always end up cutting a little bit of 400, and that's a great frequency to also cut on the kick drum, and then goose that frequency on the bass so they actually fit in nice and tight. And because you cut that 400 on your rhythm distortion guitars, the bass also has a little bit of growl in that frequency, which then lets you hear the actual notes, or not just like woo,
Yeah, yeah.
that sort of
Totally,
thing.
exactly.
Yeah. Then
Because that's the other thing with bass guitar too, is bass guitar is not just bass frequencies. People think that, don't they? But you want to have a little, like quite a bit of mid-range
Yeah,
sort of things,
for sure.
especially low mids to give it the clarity of the bass, right?
Yep. And
Bass guitar.
have you ever heard a recording on your phone speaker, and you said, "Man, the bass sounds great on that."
Yeah, because it just picks up all the right
Yeah,
frequencies. doesn't it?
all
Yeah,
the
exactly.
upper harmonics are in place. And the thing is, if your bass is too clean, especially in a rock recording, it's very hard to actually get that bass to register the actual notes. So then what you end up doing is make a copy of it and distort the hell out of it, and then blend that in, and then you can maybe cut all the lows and the highs a little bit, and just keep that mid range to define the notes. One of the old school, they would always track a DI and mic the amp, back in the
Yeah.
70s and stuff like that. So slightly higher up, from around 3 or 400, 7 to 800 hertz is a great place to boost if you think your guitar's sounding a little on the thinner side, because that's a nice clear mid-range frequency. Actually anything between 700 to around 1K, maybe 950, not just one, because one starts getting into like that almost nasal frequency. It starts there all the way up to like 2.5 3 kilohertz. So around 700 hertz is what I'm boosting right now. So let's have a listen without the EQ. Okay, so let's put that back on. So now I'll boost it a lot just so we can hear what that frequency sounds like. It's this, if you do too much, it sounds honky AFs, but a little bit, maybe say a 2 or 3 dB can make the difference in having to push the guitar up too loud in the track and just bring out the right frequency. So it sounds nice and full, but it's not overpowering everything else.
Totally.
Around 1.6K now on this EQ is like now where your high mids actually start. So that's like, yep. If you compare that to, that's your 700, that's 1.6, that's 3.2. Now we're going to get into like the presence frequencies. That's 4.8, and that's 7.2. So you can, hear different parts of the guitar spectrum, that get boosted. And I purposely like exaggerated the EQ almost uncomfortably, just so we can clearly hear the difference between them. But usually those mid-range frequencies, I'm not really messing with more than around 3 dB at the most. Anything more than that is kind of like totally redefining your guitar sound. You might as well have used a different speaker cab.
Exactly.
Or a different guitar.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And the other thing too is when you, like, a lot of times people think about boosting frequencies, but cutting frequencies can be just as useful too.
Totally.
Because if you just keep turning everything up, you don't get anything. Or what happens is it's perspective, isn't it? Like if you turn up a whole lot of mid range,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the same thing as turning down treble and turning down bass,
Mm-hmm.
isn't it? You know, from neutral. So interesting, isn't it? Yeah, the old EQ pedal is one that's super useful. And it's one thing I like with the fractals is how easy it is to kind of sculpt sound with things like that. You
Yeah.
know, the EQ, the power of the EQs is better than any pedal I've found yet. And I imagine the Line 6 that you use, the what's it called, the Helix
Yep.
HX Stomp,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, isn't it? Is it HX?
HX
Those
Stomp, yeah.
probably have some really powerful sculpting tools because it makes the frequencies make such a huge
Yeah,
difference.
they do.
But I think at the end of the day, people need to use their ears for this stuff too.
Yeah, for
I think
sure.
sometimes some engineers get far too caught up in numbers and and things like they automatically put a low cut on rather than
The
listening.
worst is,
Do you know what I mean?
this is the preset I always use for guitar, and they just apply it.
Oh, I know. Hate
Man,
that.
it's like, did you? Never mind. Another thing is with regards to the EQ. EQing before an amp is totally different to EQing after the speaker cabinet. It's a totally different thing as
Exactly.
far as I'm concerned, because when you're EQing into an amp, you're basically boosting frequencies that then overdrive or compress into the amp. You know what I mean? Even if like in your post processing chain, if you've got a compressor and then you've got an EQ, it sounds totally different if you switch the auto and EQ into the compressor, because when you push frequencies up into the compressor, you're actually getting those frequencies to compress faster.
Yeah.
So it's almost like how a
Exactly.
DSR works. They're like goosing that into the compressor, and just it grabs just that every time that frequency gets, excited. Without, sounding too technical, it's worth playing with that, order, and just letting your ears get acclimatized to what each, what each process sounds like. And if I've got a distorted amp and I'm EQing into that, it's almost like, character. It's like the
Yeah.
difference, but it's like using your tone knobs on your guitar. That's like the crudest form of, EQ before distortion. It's like, it's the low mids that are getting distorted, and now I'll bring all the high mids back. All that harmonic information is coming out then. That sort of thing.
Totally. I'm always a fan. I pretty much don't run compressors anymore. Where I do run them is off the end of the mic rather than before the thing, because I think that the compressor can be useful at that point for me. But most of the time, I find, like, for exactly that reason, that it shapes a compressor going into an amp shapes the tone too much for me. And also, I like dynamic range and things, so I'm happy whatever has to happen after the microphone, but I usually, because you're right, it does. A compressor into an amp is completely different from a compressor after a microphone.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people need to think about this sort of stuff too, is like where you place stuff is so critical to how the process is going to come out. Those old Boss EQ pedals were really useful, and I see Tom Bukovac is always pushing those as sort of his favorite tone sculpting thing. But it's completely different if you do it at the desk as well. And those Neve consoles, one of the reasons they were so great, the preset kind of frequencies, like you mentioned, are all like exactly where like rock and roll lives, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? 70, 160, 2K is it, whatever there's 8K. They're all at exactly the right places
Yeah.
for rock and roll.
Totally. And the last thing I want to talk about in terms of EQ is basically chopping off the high end. Not necessarily boosting it, but here's an example. So this is like my unfiltered top end. So now if I filter 18 kilohertz, very subtle, it sounds maybe a touch smoother. 14, I start hearing it on headphones, again, nothing really drastic. 10 kilohertz, 8 kilohertz, now you start hearing it slightly duller, but which is also when you're using an IR, sometimes it's a good idea to filter everything past 8 kilohertz in case you don't want all that top end information. And finally, 6
Well, and
kilohertz.
two, A big one I was going to say when you mentioned that about with using a modeler or an IR about filtering it above 8K is generally how you're listening to modelers too. You know, they're either direct into studio monitors or direct into headphones or in-ear monitors, and the last thing you want is like high frequencies straight into your ear.
Yeah.
It's just awful. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I tend to set mine at 8K, but you're right. It's sort of you don't. It does smooth out that top end and not necessarily like don't be scared of treble. It
Yeah.
can be a good thing too.
Yeah.
Um,
And like say, you by the time you get to around 3 or 4 kilohertz, it starts sounding like almost like it went to some kind of an analog thing and came back because like all the top end's missing. So to give you an example, actually what I'll do is I'll pull up a Pultec, which is like the most commonly used studio EQ back in the 60s and 70s. So that kind of has a function where it lets you boost and cut at the same time, which is pretty interesting. So what I'll just do is demo the cut at around 3 kilohertz. Okay, you'll hear it right away. Oh, sorry, at 5 kilohertz. My bad. Now I went really extreme with it, but just listen to what a subtle cut can do. I'll put it off. Here's it on. It instantly warms it up a little bit, and let's go a little further. It'll take around 7 dB off. Still completely usable, It doesn't sound like dark as such. The moment you like push it past that point, this is like 10 dB.
And the thing I
full.
found too is that the type of guitar you're using makes a difference with that too, because
Yep.
if you had a tele bridge pickup, which can be, they can sometimes be really cutting.
Yep.
Just a little bit of smoothing of that can take it from being an average guitar tone to an amazing
Yep.
one, right? Les Paul less so because they don't have as much. The general mid frequency of a Les Paul is lower than a Fender type pickup. You know what I mean?
So here's my thought about chasing a guitar sound that you heard on record, and you go and buy the same guitar, and you go and buy the same amp and the same speaker. You may even get the same pick and same strings and stuff like that. And what about where that mic was on that cabinet? The brand of cable they were using, what mic pre was it? What were the EQ settings on the console? What kind of tape did it go to? When it came back to the console, did they EQ it again after that to make up for some loss, if at all? Was it hitting any compressors? Did it saturate the tape? Did it get EQ'd again during mastering? They would have a certain EQ for vinyl and everything. And by the time you're listening to it, that thing has gone through so many different, processes. And what exactly are you trying to chase, in that? You're never going to get it sounding exact. I mean, you can get some of the character. So that component is something that you could, be looking at. But if you're going to
I guess for me that's why. Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say. I guess for me that's why I've never really been that interested in kind of like having to have the Jimi Hendrix guitar or the Wes Montgomery guitar or the Eric Johnson guitar, the actual model they use and the same amp and that stuff. Because to me, what I'd rather do is like use the gear I have to try and like something like this. Go right. How do I get say a Robin Ford tone using this? Because it's totally possible. Do you know what I mean? It just comes down to how you adjust things. So it requires you using your ear.
Yeah.
But tone chasing is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because a lot of people do they I've got to get that Jimi Hendrix pedal that just came out, and I'll sound just like Jimmy, and then get disappointed when they sound nothing like Jimmy.
Now look at it. I mean, I've got a Les Paul, right? I show up to a jam with a Les Paul and a Marshall, and someone comes up to say, "Hey, can we play Little Wing?" I'm going to say, "Hey, I can't play it because I don't have the Strat." I'll just turn the neck pickup down a little bit and go. That you get on with the job. You play it, and it sounds like Little Wing. It doesn't sound exactly like it did on that day, but close enough to to get the job done.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And because you know how to manipulate the gear you have, right? Whatever you have in your hands, like a Les Paul, you go, okay, I'm going to get a Hendrixy type thing, and yeah, I think that's one of the key things to do. So I always tell my students, experiment with this stuff. sit down, and you're never going to find a guitar tone that you like if you don't have a sound in your head first. You got to know what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And then you got to sit down and use the gear you've got now, try and make it happen. Even like if it's modest gear, you can usually you can get a decent clean sound that sounds like whatever. Yeah. I mean, metal can be a bit harder if you don't have an overdrive. A Strat into a clean Fender amp, you know, and you're a metal guitarist without an overdrive. That's one that you can't achieve without a certain gear, but most stuff you can.
Well, actually, if you're looking at like a Fender amp, like say a deluxe reverb, for example, okay, turn the bass down to 0, turn the treble up to around 7 or something, and crank the bloody volume till that guy's shaking, and then maybe put a tube scream or something in front of it, and then you may have to EQ a little bit of the low mid out of it, in post. You get the job done. If that's all you had available to you, for example.
But that requires having a tube screamer. That's what I was meaning. If you don't have there is some gear required to get certain things. Like the Edge. You can't do an Edge sound without delay.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Maybe you can, but for most guitar tones, yeah, it's achievable with whatever you have. Like you mentioned last episode about making a P90 sound like a humbucker.
Mm-hmm.
It's totally achievable. I've got a single coil here. I could make this.
Yeah.
That's pretty close, right? And I've turned the tone control down to about 4 or 5, and playing a certain kind of way, but you totally can do it with whatever you've got. And that's the key thing, I think, to experiment, using the gear you've got, the knowledge you've got, and trying to see, can you create a sound?
Yeah.
It's
also, I
then
think,
refining that.
Is hearing the target sound in your head clearly enough? For example, if you've got a vision of, like, say, a lake with a tree next to it, and there's a mountain in the background, you can see that thing, like, super clear in your head. It's much easier to paint it, as you go. And the same thing with the guitar. I think it's like subconsciously your hands move in a certain way that gets you closer to that sound if you have that, clearly implanted in your mind. If you don't know...
let's do it. Let's do a test of that now, right? You've got a Les Paul in your hand. What amp are you running through?
Just the old 70s Marshall.
70s Marshall. You got any pedals in front of you?
Yeah, I've got some pedals.
Right, find me a Jimmy Page sound. That should be an easy one. You got a Led Zeppelin t-shirt on?
You
got a Les Paul and a Marshall.
Close enough, right?
Right. So there's a Jimi Hendrix sound. Find me David Gilmour Comfortably Numb sound.
Okay. Let's see. Maybe...
Just with what gear you've got right there.
Okay, I do have
really
a flanger. Getting there. Let's see. Maybe put on I think the Voodoo one should be a good one to try.
It's pretty close. Like,
yeah.
Now find me a Nirvana Smells Like Teen Spirit sound. The clean one.
Oh, yeah. Again, with the...
No, Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Oh, that one. Oh, sorry. That's without the flange. Sorry. Okay, so we need to kind of thin that out a little bit. So, oh, there we go. Maybe a little less gain or whatever.
It's in the ballpark, isn't it?
Sorry? Yeah, it's in the ballpark.
It's in the ballpark.
Enough to start the song, and then you hit the distortion and go...
Go on then, give us the distortion bit. With what you've got.
Copyright strike.
So it just shows that same guitar, same amp, and very clear directives of what to achieve, right?
Yeah.
But you heard in your head how those were supposed to go, and you made it work with the equipment.
Let's say you want to do the edge as well, right? Where do you go? need to exaggerate the delay a little bit more. Maybe only neck pickup. It's just about getting the right amount of headroom that I'm still searching for. Somewhere around there. Could get there.
Yeah. Right, so you can see and that's the key thing, and that's what I find. A lot of stuff for me, sessions are usually about that. You know, I'll swap guitars. I've got a bunch of guitars here because the flavor when you're recording comes out more often.
Yeah.
But even live gigs, I think I've told you I've got We Will Rock You coming up in a couple of weeks. We start. Which, speaking of which, I probably should look at the music. But I was thinking about what gear I'm going to take, right, to do the Brian May thing, because it's quite specific. This guitar will be one that I'll take mostly because of that. That.
I was going to say crazy little thing.
It's a bridge pickup tally thing, and then a lot of the stuff I'm going to play like my AR420, which is like a Les Paul type guitar for a lot of it, because that shows a little more rocked up than how Queen play those songs. Do you know what I mean? But I'll take that guitar, and one of the main reasons I'm going to take that is I've got coil taps on both humbuckers, so I can get a humbucker sound. I can coil tap it to get a single coil like super quick without changing, because there's lots of that in the show, and there's no time to swap. The other thing too is we're on stage and we're seen. Like there's a platform thing that's apparently we're right up there in the middle. In 2 songs I have to actually come and step forward and take the solos and come down on the stage. But so I'll have to try and figure it. So I'm going to have to do what you just did and make it work to get all those different tones from the one thing. Do
you have a treble booster handy by any chance?
I do. There's a treble booster in the Fractal.
Yeah.
But I tried it the other day and I hated it. I was like,
it's
I
never
hate
going
that
to do
sound.
it. That's one effect that it's very hard to model. I think that and fuzz, just because of the very unpredictable nature of how those germanium transistors. I think there's also like an impedance thing that happens. There's actually like a physical reaction between the pickups and the first thing in the pedal. So when you turn that volume,
Totally agree.
it does that whole sparkly cleanup thing. But it also there's this very pleasant range on the whole volume knob. You kind of get the whole range of...
It's got to be straight off the guitar, doesn't it?
Which is why...
The treble booster only works straight on the guitar.
Yeah, which is why Brian May, he's got his wireless belt pack on the guitar, but he's got a treble booster in a box that sits before the...
On the strap.
Before the transmitter, yeah. I found that quite cool. So he's got the...
Because it does make a difference, doesn't it?
It does make a huge difference. I was going to say, if you don't have an analog treble booster, I've got an old full-tone Ranger that'll do the job nicely. So maybe I'll...
Yeah, the part of what I'm thinking with this too is it doesn't have to be exactly like those albums. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? And I've listened to the London cast doing it, and they, while I haven't looked at the music so much yet, I've been listening to the recordings and what have you, and they rock it up a lot more than Queen do.
Oh, okay.
And I think that's generally the direction it's going to go. That's why I'm thinking a humbucker guitar rather than, trying to get a sound that's the Red Special, because essentially those are Burns single coils. Mm-hmm. So I could do it with this plus a treble booster, but I'm like, man, that's going to be that'll be crazy.
Yeah. Here's an interesting thing about Brian May as well. He told the engineers that they were forbidden to add reverb to his guitar signal. He said if you want some reflections, move the mic or add a second room mic, but don't add any reverb. I think this was probably during the 70s, because you can hear all the the schmo stuff in the 80s and 90s as well. But I think at that time he had a little bit of a purist, But he's an interesting guy with regards to EQ. So first of all, he's got those phase switches on his guitar. You can put each pickup in and out of phase with the other ones, which creates a whole bunch of, phase cancellation. So the lows sometimes drop out dramatically. Mm-hmm. I think what happens is the fundamental frequencies get cancelled, but all the harmonics, they, going into distortion, those things just come out and they scream. So the solo, I think, of Bohemian Rhapsody is the neck and the middle pickup out of phase with each other.
It is, totally, yep.
And you can hear that. And
it's got that mid-range kind of thing going on.
Yeah. And he had this little, I think, a battery amp that John Deacon built him out of some hi-fi amp parts that he found. The Deaky. So the Deaky's got like a very small, tiny speaker, and apparently just moving the mic on the Deaky, they could like EQ the thing to kind of get the layer to sit in the right equal. Because if you listen to him layering like 5 or 6 guitar parts, by the time you layer 6 guitar parts with exactly the same sound, those frequencies are just going to start multiplying and building up to the point where they all start fighting. The layers start fighting with each other.
Or cancelling.
So you need
Because
to
of
actually
phase and
change
stuff,
the EQ on each of those parts, and you can do that in post. You can notch out the mids, push some of the other frequencies up, and sort of stuff. But if you can hear it in the mix while you move that mic, and you actually do the EQ by that, which is pretty cool. And then down to the phase changes on the guitar. So each of those layers, it almost sounds like a symphony orchestra when they come together, because they're all adding different frequencies to the mix.
Yeah.
One of the
Totally.
songs I loved when he did this is one called All Dead, All Dead, which I think he wrote and he sang on. But there's this little thing where he builds up this orchestral thing in the middle. And I think even Love of My Life, there's a little bit where he does that. It's all, using the guitars in a very non-guitar-y way. It's almost like a texture that, is just built up layer by layer, which I think is like amazing. And you've probably heard that Lyle Workman album, Harmonic Crusader, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
There's one
It's one
song
of my
and I'll forgotten the name. Maybe if I find it, I'll put it there. But that's something which he did as well. And I love that thing where you actually build it up like almost like a tapestry, layer by layer, till it you have the overall effect of something much bigger than the actual just playing guitar.
The one I've struggled with the most actually is I Want to Break Free. It's got that synth guitar thing. So someone told me it was a keyboard
It
once,
was.
but I'm
It totally
convinced-
was. There's this guy called
sure? It
Fred
sounds like
Mantle.
a-
No, he's a Canadian keyboard player who was around at the time. I think Brian May took a pass at it, and then Freddie wanted the synths to be the thing, which I think they got into a little tiff about it. So it definitely was the keyboard.
Because I had a look at the chart and it's actually written in there for the guitar to play. So I was thinking, and I listened to the London cast and they just do it with a distorted sound. They don't even bother trying to get the right sound. But I thought, I wonder what. And I got kind of close to it.
Cool.
That was about as close as I could get to
Yeah.
it, with programming it in the fractal.
How
And I
long did you
thought,
take to
well,
set
I'll see
the
what the MD
sensitivity
wants
on
to
that?
do. Sorry?
How long did you take to set the sensitivity on that?
Ages.
I figured.
Quite hard to get that to do. And also to the cutoff, right?
Yep.
But it's not, like I listened to the track, it's not completely dry. It's actually, there's a little bit of reverb. I don't know, to me it sounds like a guitar because it's got, like, unless it was someone very skilled with a pitch bend
It was that guy.
on the
He
keyboard.
was trying to make it sound like a guitar. That was the whole idea, make the keyboard sound like a guitar.
Man, well, he did a good job of, the nuance in it to make it very guitar-like,
Yeah, you should Google that guy's
But
name.
yeah, I've got to play that one.
He's an interesting guy. I think he ended up like not a few years back playing with Philip Sace.
Oh, amazing guitar player.
Yeah.
Man, I love Philip Sace's playing. So that was one sound I've got. And then, of course, clean sound. So the amp I've set up for these so far is a Morgan AC20.
Okay.
So this is the... Oops. The clean sound. Which I really liked. It's pretty dry, but... This is with a clon in front of it. I thought the clon kind of did some interesting things with it. That was kind of an interesting one. And then I tried the same thing, but with a BB preamp in front of it.
Does the Axe have a sixpence emulation?
I know, right? That's the other thing I was thinking is, like, how far do I go with this? Do I go with the sixpence penny thing? The other one I found that was really interesting for that sort of sound was the Timmy. Kind of about here. It's not quite that sound for that, but they're,
They
yeah,
sound
kind of
close
been
enough. You
experimenting.
know what's
That's the clon into that little, and I thought that was an interesting one. That's probably the closest term to terms of mid-range character. Yeah, so I think I might actually use that. So that's a, oops, sorry, that's a Morgan AC20 into a, what cab did I end up using? A
have you
four by
tried
12 with EVs.
have you tried putting a phaser before the clone on a very
I
slow
did.
sweep?
Yeah, I did.
Because
I did,
apparently,
and mostly because I was trying to do that synth sound, and actually putting the phaser in there really helped. So that's actually like if I go back to that, and I'll show you the different parts of it. So this is bass guitar sound, two overdrives, and then I put the phaser in, and then the filter. Whoops, trying to get that to trigger, and then synth. This is a synth, but it's not all that much of the synth. If I turn the synth right up, you'll hear it. In fact, why don't I turn all the others off and show you what the synth's doing? Oops. So this is the synth.
cool. Yeah, you get
So
that.
it's gated as well to
Yeah.
try and get that gating to the keyboard thing, you know. Yeah, interesting, eh?
You know, the thing is,
Not
like,
an easy one.
you've just gone about it by having a very clear idea of the sound in your head and then just using what you've had available to you and knowing what your tools well enough to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do to get close to it.
That's what's interesting about these fractal things is the amount of control you've got is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
So for these sort of shows, it's like, to me, it's a must to have. And also, too, the other thing is I'm on stage and they've got this sort of platform thing that kind of comes up. So I'm not going to be able to get an amp up there
Yeah.
anyway. And even if I could, it's on a metal railing with racks, and it's gonna sound like crap.
Yeah.
Like it'll be rattling the whole thing. It'll. So I have to. You have to go to direct on those theatre shows now. That's kind of just. I remember last time I did, I actually even bought a little powered speaker just so I could try and get a little bit of feedback with it, And the sound guy goes, "Whoa, man, what are you doing? Turn your speaker off." And I was like, "All right." So yeah, it's going to be one of those, and I'll have to be on in-ears because I have to go down on stage and do a couple of things.
Right.
But yeah, it's exactly what I did. I'm going to make it work with the gear I've got. I'll probably end up playing this a bit, and like I said, I'll play that 420 that's over there, which is it's really like a Les Paul. It's got that the mid-rangey mahogany neck, mahogany guitar,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you be running stereo or just mono?
stereo. Yeah.
Because if
I've always done mono for a long time now, but I've been getting more and more into stereo, and I'm finding that if I can do stereo, I will. It depends on the engineer too. If it's someone I think, I know this guy, and I know he tends to. Oh, I don't like his mixing, but I think that he's a classic musical theatre mixer where loads of vocals, loads of drums, not a lot of anything else. That's how they mix, But on this one, he's going to have to turn the guitar up, right? Because you can't have the Bohemian Rhapsody solo and someone on stage and not be hearing the guitar, right?
Yeah.
So I figure I might as well go in stereo and make it as big and lush and full as I can. You know what I mean? Yeah, because it's going to be turned up. I'm hoping.
I don't know if I ever told you
Fingers
this story.
crossed.
My wedding, the reception was basically 2 days of just non-stop jamming, as you can imagine. Like all my muso buddies and everything turned up. So there was a friend of mine driving from Bombay to Bangalore. So he was like, "Do you want me to take anything? I'm doing the drive." So I said, "Would you be able to take my old Fender?" So he brought my old Pro Reverb with him, and the 335. So we had a little sound check or whatever. So that amp doesn't really deliver the goods until you give it a bit of juice. So I turned it up to like 4 or 5. I just started gritting up a bit, perfect for rock and roll and stuff like that. And the sound guy comes and tells me, like, very concerned, I think that amp is like really loud. I said, man, it's my wedding today. I'm the groom. I think you can manage.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the one time I think I can get away with it. You know what I mean? Leave me alone. It's interesting. I saw Daniel Steinhardt, as in Dan and Mick as part of that pedal show. I don't know if you've watched them. That on YouTube, and they. I know Dan a little bit. He's an Australian guy. He's a nice cat actually. But he went and saw the Foo Fighters the other day, and he said he got to stand side of stage and sort of check it out and listen to the whole thing. And he said it was just fantastic. He said no modeling shit, just no digital shit, just rock and roll guitar. And I like literally the next video that came up in my feed was about Chris Shiflett moving over to Kemper or Fractal or whatever he's doing. Like he's going that way. He's decided, and I thought, wow, there's a gig where you can do whatever you want,
Yeah.
right? If you're playing a Foo Fighters gig, so I thought, I wonder why he's doing it. And I watched this video, and he said because he's running in-ears anyway, and he said he found them when he went out and did some of his own shows, he found the modeler just sounded better. It was more consistently good in his in-ears.
Yeah.
And so he thought, that's what I'm going to do. And
I was
thought,
going
wow,
to say,
okay.
if he's on in-ears, it would be, like a shame not to use the model.
Yeah. Well, I don't know though. If you can get away with like a cranked Fried, I think he had a couple of Friedmans up there, and sort of they would have been cranking. They would, you could tell by the guitar sound that it was like. But it kind of it's interesting that he was saying that he preferred it, that he was sort of going to move more in that direction. I don't know if he was talking about for Foos or necessarily for his own solo gigs. It could have been talking about his own gigs. But he was just saying that it was kind of become a thing. But straight after Dan saying, no digital crap. And then literally the next video,
I've got a story like that actually, because just before I moved to New Zealand, I wanted to save up some money. So a friend of mine got me a gig playing guitar on this TV show where we were like, like the Jay Leno show or something, like they have a band. But the thing is, they had like these guys doing stand-up comedy, and they wanted us to like put these little interjections at times. So you just hit like a
oh yeah,
something like that. So at that time, the only amp I had was my old JCM 800. So I used to cut that and a 2x12, and have a setup on stage, mic'd and everything. And I mean, to me on stage it sounded fine, and I never really, listened to the broadcast. And one of my friends said, "Have you listened to what your guitar sounds like on the broadcast?" I said, "No, why?" So just have a listen. So I don't know what those guys were doing, but it sounded like nothing like what I was hearing on stage. So I was like, okay, cool. Next time I just asked my friend, "Can I borrow your pod?" So I took the Bean pod and ran that. I set a Soldan, one of those, emulations, and just ran it direct. That thing sounded so much better on the next broadcast. I was like, man, I've been lugging this amp for, sweet F all.
yeah. Man, when I first met Andy Timmins, we played one of those Mission Estate gigs in Napier, and it was with Krista Berg, who had a big hit with that song, "The Lady in Red," and Olivia Newton-John, who had a big hit with her Physical and what have you. And I was supposed to back both of them, but that gig a couple of times now, it's fallen through. And they said, oh, well, Olivia's going to bring her own band, but you can still do the Krista Berg gig, So I was like, yeah, cool. And then I turn up and I walk in and there's Andy Timmins, and I'm like, wow, So it's the first time I got to meet Andy. He had one of those Kidney Bean Line 6 pods. And at the time I was using one of those Red Knob Fender Twins, which actually, those are good amps, man. I know a lot of people like to sort of give them a hard time, but Robin Ford also was a big fan of using a pair of those for a while, because they had a good kind of sparkly clean sound, and they handle pedals well and stuff. But anyway, I was like, I got my twin, and he goes, oh man, I've got it all dialed in. He goes, don't worry. I'm like, you sure you can use it if you want? He goes, no, it's all dialed in, it's all ready to go, and just go. So he did that, and it was still like a killer guitar sound.
Yeah.
Because Andy plays killer, you know what I mean? He's such a melodic musical person that you give him anything and it's going to work, you know what I mean? But it was interesting that he had that dialed in, and that was kind of his way of doing it, you know what I mean? And he's very much an amp guy now, will insist on it, but then Yeah, I found that interesting. Even when the option of an amp was there, it didn't make any sense
Yeah.
you know.
I mean, he's such a killer player. I'm sure, it doesn't really, as long as, I mean, the pod would have sounded okay, for, whatever he was doing.
Sounded great,
Yeah.
man. It sounded absolutely killer.
It's the
Yeah,
thing now because, sometimes you listen to a guitar sound and you say, hey, that's a great guitar tone. Now I've kind of got the ability to imagine what my playing through that tone would sound like. And very often I can
yeah,
tell
right.
it wouldn't work. Like my playing, I know there are things that will flatter it, and there are things that'll
Hmm.
kind of just make it sound like shit. So very
Totally.
often things that work for a certain guy's style, if the guy's got a really light touch, for example, and he's playing with a ton of compression, he can make it sing. But the
Hmm.
moment I have that much of things already shutting down the dynamic range, I start fighting it, and it just bugs the hell out of me, and it doesn't really let me express myself properly. You feel like
Yeah,
there's
exactly. Well,
this.
you've got a quite a hard, much harder right hand
Yeah.
than, and again that'll choke the. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I used to sit in on gigs a fair bit. I don't really so much now, but I used to, and it's very interesting going and playing someone else's gear. Really different, isn't it? The only time I've ever played someone else's gear and felt I sounded like them and not like me was Mike Stern, with his chorus effect and his, and he had that Yamaha or Tele type guitar, and it's weird. He uses really light strings, but he deliberately bows the neck
Right.
so that the action is really high in the middle and then it's kind of closer at either end, right? And but then with super light strings like nines or eights, one or the other, and so with light strings but high action, it sort of has a certain sort of feel. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that with that combination of the two Fender Twins and that chorusing effect, I played like you know those sort of things, and I
Yeah.
was like, it just sounded just like Mike Stern. But generally, when I play other people's gear,
Yeah.
I still sound like me. You know what I
There
mean?
you go.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. It happens most of the time. And I think it's in some ways it's relieving because you know that no matter what you do, you kind of have some semblance of control. Um,
Hmm.
and otherwise it's very frustrating because you can buy all these different guitars and amps, but there's still a basic character of your sound that you can't change. You're just stuck with it. And I
Yeah,
think.
it's interesting you say that. I remember my guitar. Sorry, I'll
Yeah.
just interject. My teacher said to me when I was at music school that I said I was getting really annoyed because I was like struggling to find my sound. You know what I mean? And he said, "You've already got your sound." He goes, "I already hear your sound." He goes, "You might not recognize it yet, but," he goes, "10 albums into this, you'll be it'll be right there. And you'll see a thread through all of them of something you do,"
Yeah.
which I thought was interesting.
At this point, it's just like, I'm trying to basically find all the shit parts about my playing and just take them out rather than, consciously trying and
Then add.
trying to reinvent the wheel or whatever. So every time I just like, oh, I just need to, change that up a little bit or whatever. And I think over the years also I've lightened up on the right hand touch a fair bit. At least the dynamic range is a lot more. I
Hmm.
mean, there's times where like I smack it hard, but I'm not physically, like digging in that way. Like the action could be firm, but the actual contact of the pick and the strings isn't, you know,
Yeah,
going to
it's
drive
an
them.
effect, isn't
Yeah.
it?
So it still sings even when you hit hard. Then and that takes a while to figure out, and you can't really teach someone to do that. Unfortunately, you just have to trial and error. Lighten up, dig in harder, whatever. Just till you find out, how much tension. It's like learning how to bend in tune.
Yeah.
You have a certain amount of muscle memory where okay, this is how much pressure I need to apply to get that string to move, to the correct pitch. The same thing with the right hand. And very
What's
often,
your sonic fingerprint, isn't it?
it totally is. And
Really?
very often,
Hmm.
like when we grew up watching guitar players and trying to like emulate or learn from them, we're watching their left hand, where are the fingers going on the fretboard. And these days, I'm only watching the right hand and seeing how, they hit the strings and where
Yeah,
they hit.
same.
Is it here? And what angle the pick's, gonna go at and stuff.
What's the fingers
Yeah,
doing?
how do they
You
hold their
know?
pick, that sort of thing. So it's totally like changed the priority, I think, in terms of at least trying to emulate other guitar players sounds. Yeah.
I just looking at the time, we're pretty much at an hour. We should
Yep.
probably wrap up in
We
a minute.
should.
But
Before I run out of
this has
RAM.
been an interesting conversation actually to
Yeah.
kind of talk about, because people don't think about that kind of point of what happens after your sound is recorded,
Yeah.
or getting to that point of recording it, isn't it? Like the post processing.
Totally. And I think
things,
we've
yeah.
only just scratched the tip of the iceberg. So maybe we could do a part 2, if people are interested.
100%.
Because there's a lot more that we can delve into. Anyway, lovely chatting with you today,
Yeah.
Nick. See you guys soon.
Likewise. See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.